Hello. Today I'm in central Bedfordshire and I've come back to an area of countryside where 25 years ago I came metal detecting with a group of friends. That was back in March 1999, and believe it or not, this wasn't the area we had originally planned to go detecting on. We originally had permission to search a field close to the farmhouse, which is over half a mile in that direction. But sadly, when we got there, the farmer said he'd taken advantage of the good weather and he'd seeded the field, so we couldn't really get on it. But he offered this field instead. The only problem was, as I say, it's over half a mile from the farm and it can only be accessed along a dirt track, which wasn't suitable for normal vehicles. So we had to walk. But we'd come a long way, so we thought we might as well give it a go. And because of the remoteness of this field, we weren't expecting to find an awful lot. And as it happened, that turned out to be the case. You know, after 3 hours that afternoon, we'd only found one Roman coin, a few musket balls, lots of shotgun caps and a few bits of lead and iron. So it was a bit of a waste of a day up to then. So we all decided to pack up and go home. But as we did so, we thought we might as well detect our way back across the field. You know, because a lot of nice things have been found by people actually walking back to the gate or whatever. And got halfway across the field and I had a very interesting signal. Whatever the object was, it sounded quite large and very deep. So I ended up digging a huge hole over 12 inches deep, and eventually I found a very strange looking object. And the object turned out to be a large bronze disc measuring about 5 inches across, and the disc had been folded in half. I showed the object to my colleagues out in the field, and we all come to the same conclusion, that it must have been an old brass plate off an old tractor or steam traction engine from over 100 years earlier. That's all we could think of at the time. So the disc got put into a box full of old detecting junk and then put away in a cupboard. So months later, I was sorting through my box of detecting junk, seeing what I wanted to keep and what I wanted to throw away, and I came across the old disc again. I didn't want to throw it away without knowing exactly what it was, and because I was working in engineering at the time, I thought I'd take it to work and stick it in a vise and try and straighten it out and see what it was. After a great deal of effort, I finally managed to achieve this, although sadly the disc broke in half. After that, at least I could make out some sort of detail on this badly corroded disc, so I set about trying to clean it up with a wire brush and some Scotch-Brite. After a lot of rigorous cleaning, I could now make out a lot more detail on the disc, which looked more of a commemorative item rather than an object that had come off an old tractor. I showed this medallion thing to some friends, and one of them suggested that it was possibly associated with one of the Great Wars. So I took it to another friend of mine by the name of Paul Johnson, who was a World War I archivist and historian, and he was able to confirm that it was in fact a memorial plaque dedicated to a soldier who'd been killed in the First World War. And when I told him where I'd found it, he was absolutely gobsmacked. How on earth did it get there, he said. Of course, that's what I'm trying to find out. Paul said that if we look more closely at the disc, we should find the soldier's name. And there it was, just above the lion's head. Robert Arthur Thompson. So now we had a name, Robert Arthur Thompson. So Paul went onto his computer and he checked through the casualty list from the First World War. And this is what we found on the casualty list from the Great War. Robert Arthur Thompson was in the 6th Battalion of the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment. And he came from Carshalton in Surrey. And he was a rank of sergeant, and he was killed in action, France and Flanders. And there was his serial number, G/22548. But the record also stated that Rupert came from Carshalton in Surrey, which seemed a bit odd because I found his plaque in Bedfordshire. But at least we had his details. So Paul then went on to the Commonwealth War Graves website to see if he could track down Rupert's grave. Well, we put Robert Arthur's name, regiment and rank into the search criteria, and amazingly, we got nothing. Paul altered the search details. He simply put in the initials RA and the surname Thompson. And what came up was a big surprise. What came up now was pretty amazing. We now had a Rupert Archibald Thompson, a sergeant with the same serial number, 6th Battalion, Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment, died on the 4th of April 1917, same as Robert Arthur, and a cemetery where he's buried. So now we had a bit of a mystery on our hands. Why did Rupert change his name when he joined the army? That's what I was hoping to try and find out. These were the days before I had a computer, so I had no way of furthering my research into the plaque. So the plaque simply went back into the box. Some years later, when I did get a computer, I began researching my own family history, and I uncovered some incredible stories, including a dreadful murder committed by an 8-year-old boy who happened to be my 4 times great-grandmother's nephew. Then I discovered I'm a cousin of the great strongman Jeff Capes. And there were countless war stories, including one of my ancestors who went down with his ship during the very first naval engagement of World War I. Then I discovered that my own grandmother's eldest brother was a highly decorated war hero from the First World War, and sadly he died during the Second World War. And it was while I was researching my granduncle's story about how he earned his military cross in the trenches, I suddenly remembered the plaque that had been languishing in a box for years. So I dropped all my own family history research and I began delving into Rupert's. The first record I looked up was the 1911 census, the nearest one to the Great War. And I found that Rupert was the eldest of 8 children living in Carshalton with his parents. And he's shown as being 24 years of age, and his occupation is a fishmonger's salesman. So I started building Rupert's family tree with all the information that I was able to accumulate. But I was also interested in trying to find out exactly how and where Rupert died. So I went online and tried to track down his regiment's war diaries for the period in question. I managed to download an extract from Sergeant Thompson's regiment's war diaries covering the week in which he was killed, and it makes interesting reading. Arras, the 4th of April. The night was quiet. We found large working parties. Our artillery fire opened at 6:15 AM. Bombardment was heavy but not intense. The enemy shelled Arras during the morning. One shell burst in the museum, burying some men of C Company. 6 ORs killed and 26 wounded by this one shell. We also had 4 men killed and 5 wounded by a shell when they were fetching rations. Then I looked at the days preceding the 4th. On the 3rd of April, in the trenches at Arras. The day was exceptionally quiet. The battalion was relieved by the 7th East Surrey Regiment and went into billets, cellars in the museum at Arras. Relief was completed by 6:45 PM. So we now know that Sergeant Thompson's unit were billeted in the basement of the museum in the town of Arras, and he must have been one of those men killed when it was hit by a German artillery shell. But it's also interesting to note that on the preceding day, on the 3rd of April, they were in the trenches and they were relieved by the East Surrey Regiment. And this is to become a significant part of this story, as you'll find out shortly. Now I had that information, I decided to work backwards. Now I checked the 1901 census. The 1901 census shows us the Thompson family living at number 9 Station Road in Carshalton. Rupert is now the 3rd child out of 10. He's got an elder sister and an older brother called Eric. As I entered the details of Rupert's elder brother and sister into his family tree, records automatically regarding both of them began popping up. So I began looking at his brother Eric's story. In the 1911 census, we can see that his brother Eric is actually married to a lady called Gertrude, and at that time they've got 2 children. And his wife's brother is also living with them at 43 Leslie Grove in Croydon. But then a death record popped up suggesting that Eric may have died in 1917, and it began to sound ominously as if Eric, like his younger brother Rupert, may have gone off to fight in the trenches when the war broke out. And this was confirmed when I checked the military records, and I was shocked to find that Eric was actually serving in the East Surrey Regiment. Now you'll remember from the diaries, the East Surreys were also in Arras at the same time as the Royal West Surreys, and they were fighting alongside each other, taking it in turns in the trenches. But even more shocking was when I found that Eric was killed in action on the 7th of May, just 4 weeks after his younger brother Rupert. This would have been bad enough for Eric's wife and children, but for his parents, who were already reeling at the news of the death of their son Rupert and trying to come to terms with that, only to get a telegram 4 weeks later telling them that they'd lost another son, must have brought unimaginable grief to the whole family. But the tragedies didn't stop there. But I still had two mysteries on my hand. Why would Rupert change his name? And who buried his plaque in a field in Bedfordshire? There could be a whole host of reasons why Rupert changed his name when he joined the army. Now you remember, he was 27 years of age when the war broke out, and of course by the time he died in 1917 he'd reached the rank of sergeant, which suggests that he probably joined the army 2 or 3 years before the war. His age wouldn't have been a problem. So I've considered the possibility that he might have had a medical condition which would have excluded him from military service, but I've got no way of verifying that. There's also the possibility that he had a criminal record. Again, that might have excluded him from military service, but from the records that I can find, it doesn't appear to be the case. I've also come up with a rather fanciful theory that maybe he had a dalliance with a young lady, resulting in a pregnancy, and rather than stay and face up to his responsibilities, we're better to hide. Join the army under a false name and disappear. You never know. And but there's also the possibility that maybe he just didn't like his own name, Rupert Archibald. You know, he wanted to be a warrior, and he wanted a warrior's name. He wants something more macho. Robert Arthur. You never know. Sadly, I'm never going to know. And there's no way of knowing just how many soldiers changed their name when they joined up in the First World War. But Rupert certainly wasn't unique. You know, in a churchyard not far from where I live, I found another soldier who did exactly the same thing. This is Private Charles Nodes, who served in the Royal Berkshire Regiment during the First World War. And strangely enough, he died in August 1919, 9 months after the end of the war. So I don't know the cause of his death, whether it was a long-term injury or whether he died in the Spanish flu outbreak in 1919, I don't know. But what's interesting on this gravestone, although it gives his name, Charles Nodes, it also says served as Charles Bullard. So I was quite interested to find out what the story was behind that. Charles Nodes was actually born Charles Bullard in 1898. His mother Esther wasn't married at the time, so he was illegitimate, but they lived here in this cottage in the lane by the church. Some years later, Esther married a man called James Nodes, and he adopted Charles as his son, so Charles Bullard became Charles Nodes. However, when the war broke out, Charles enlisted under his birth name of Bullard, and this was obviously to honour the family name, unless of course he just didn't like his stepfather. And then there's the other question. Just how did Rupert's plaque end up being buried right out in the middle of this field in Bedfordshire? That is the bigger mystery. I carried out extensive research into just about everybody I could in Rupert's family, and I couldn't find any evidence whatsoever that anybody in his family had any connections to the county of Bedfordshire. So I'm fairly confident that nobody in his family was responsible for burying it in the field out there. So if they didn't do it, who did? I've only come up with one possible theory, and that's quite possibly that after the war, when these plaques were produced and distributed to the families of all the dead soldiers, Rupert's plaque must have been mistakenly sent to the wrong family. If this indeed is what happened, then it's fair to assume that the plaque would have been sent to a family with the same surname. So I toured all the villages in the area where I found the plaque, looking for a war memorial with a soldier by the name of Thompson. and I only found one. I come to the village of Flitton in Bedfordshire, which is just over a mile from where I found the plaque, and the war memorial here is in the churchyard. This memorial bore the name of a soldier by the name of Thomas Charles Thompson, who was a private in the Middlesex Regiment, and he died on the 28th of October 1916, just at the end of the Battle of the Somme. Could it be possible that Thomas's parents received Rupert's plaque by mistake? If this is indeed what did happen, and that Charles Thompson's family received Rupert's plaque by mistake, you can understand the anger and the frustration of his parents at some bungling official getting it wrong. But the idea that Charles's father or somebody in his family would walk over a mile out into the countryside, go out into the middle of that massive field and bury the plaque doesn't make sense. It just doesn't add up. You know, it just seems a bit far-fetched. But I haven't got any other theories. I really haven't. This is one mystery that's been bugging me for years. My next task was to try and track down any living descendants from Rupert's family. Rupert never married, so he had no children that I'm aware of. And frustratingly, as I searched through the records of all his brothers and sisters, it seemed very few of them had children either. But Rupert's older brother Eric was married and he had 3 children, so he became the focus of my research. Eric's eldest son, Reginald, went on to have a son by the name of John, but sadly John died in 2001. When I checked Frida's records, I could find no record of a marriage or any children, and strangely enough she died in 1953 in Stoke Mandeville Hospital in Aylesbury. So I was left with Muriel. Muriel, however, did get married and she had 2 children, a son named Alan and a daughter named June. It seemed that Alan and June were now my only hope of furthering research into the plaque story. But then I got another shock. As I continued research into Eric's story, I learned that his wife Gertrude died in the Spanish flu outbreak in 1919. This meant that Eric's children would have become orphans, and I was now worried about how this would affect my research. I searched an online directory and I came up with 3 Alan Woods. I rang the first 2 and sadly they weren't who I was looking for. When I rang the third one, I got lucky. But it was actually Alan's wife who answered the phone. Apparently her husband was out. And when I explained who I was and why I was ringing, she was pretty amazed. But she said that she'd get her husband to ring me back as soon as he got home. When Alan did bring me back, I asked him if he was the grandson of Eric Stuart Thompson, and he confirmed it. Yes, he was. And I explained who I was and what I'd found out in the field. And he was absolutely gobsmacked. You know, he knew precious little about any of his family history. And he was desperate to know more, obviously. But he suggested that I contact his sister June, who actually lived up near Newmarket in Suffolk. And so he gave me her details, and later on I actually contacted his sister June. And again I went over the details of what I'd found and what I'd learned, and she was absolutely gobsmacked as well. You know, she knew precious little about the family history. But she suggested that I actually come out to Suffolk and visit her and bring all the stuff that I'd found. I mean, she was really excited and really wanted to see all this. And so, of course, so was I. And we set a date and off I went to Suffolk. When I arrived at June's house in Suffolk, I was pleased to find that her brother Alan had turned up also. And as we sat around a table, I went over the whole unbelievable story from the detecting expedition in Bedfordshire, finding the plaque, and then the research that had led me to this point. June and Alan were completely stunned by all of this. June actually surprised me. She went and fetched a biscuit tin which was full of photographs and letters and all sorts, and she laid it all out on the table. And these were left to her by her mother when her mother died. And she actually picked out some photographs of her grandfather Eric with his wife Gertrude and the 3 children, which I thought was amazing. And of course then she also had photographs of Eric as a soldier, which was even more thrilling for me. You know, finally putting faces to the names in this story, it was unbelievable. And she explained that when her grandmother died of Spanish flu after the Great War, the 3 children were farmed off to be raised by other families. And as a consequence of that, they became disconnected from the main family. And of course, as a consequence of that, June and Alan knew virtually nothing about their extended family history. And so, of course, as she laid all the photographs out, you know, these photographs all had inscriptions on the back, but they didn't know who any of these people were. But because I'd done all the research into the family history, I was able to tell her who everybody was. Oh, and they were absolutely ecstatic, you know. All their family history was now being put into context. And for me, I felt so proud to be able to do it. And then, of course, she pulled out another photograph. This one was a group of soldiers. And on the back, it said, Rupert, 3rd from left. I just could not believe it. Here was the man on the plaque. And I can't tell you how I felt finally having a face to the name on that plaque. It was unbelievable. As I studied the photograph of Rupert with his comrades, it was clear that the picture had been taken quite early in his military career. He's only a private, whereas he was a sergeant by the time he was killed. And when I asked June and Alan if they had any idea why he would have changed his name when he enlisted, they hadn't got a clue, because up until the time they met me, they didn't even know about Rupert. They didn't know about any of their grandfather's family. So it was just a bigger mystery to them as it was to me, as indeed the explanation of how the plaque ended up in a field in Bedfordshire. They don't know of any family member in Bedfordshire. So it didn't look as if I was going to get any answers to those big questions. But I was happy with what I'd got. Rupert's story is unlikely ever to have an ending. I'm never going to know why he changed his name. And I'm never also going to know who buried his plaque in this field in Bedfordshire. But it does go to show what amazing stories can emerge just by finding a piece of metal with a name on it.